It started with a promise, a simple one, the kind you make without thinking, because you assume, of course, that you'll be around to keep it. On the morning of October 15th, Robert Henley kissed his wife Charlotte goodbye, told her he just needed one last solo hike to clear his head after retiring, and said he'd be back by dinner. He'd done this 100 times before. Hiking Mount Rainier was his therapy, his sanctuary. He knew every trail, every ridge, every whisper of wind through the pines. He was a man who planned everything down to the last detail. So when he didn't come home that night, Charlotte didn't panic, not at first. She figured he lost track of time, maybe camped out under the stars. But by morning, with no call, no text, nothing, her stomach dropped. And when the days turned into weeks and the search teams came up empty, that fear hardened into something unbearable, the not knowing.
For 4 years, that's all she had. Silence. Grief without closure. The official story? Robert either got lost, took his own life, or met with a tragic accident. The case went cold. The world moved on. But Charlotte never did. She kept his coffee mug on the shelf. His favorite jacket still hung by the door. She'd stand at the kitchen window every morning, staring at the silhouette of Mount Rainier in the distance, wondering what really happened to the man she'd loved for over 40 years. And then, out of nowhere, a phone call shattered the quiet. It was a ranger from Mount Rainier National Park. A backpack, waterlogged, torn, covered in mud, had been found trapped in a beaver dam, 8 miles downstream from Spray Falls. They'd traced it through the GPS serial number. It belonged to Robert. When Charlotte walked into the ranger station and saw that backpack, the gray and blue one she'd given him for his 60th birthday, the red carabiner still clipped to the side, her knees nearly gave out. It wasn't just that it had been found. It was where it had been found. The GPS data showed Robert had gone miles off his registered trail, into a remote, dangerous part of the wilderness. The police said it proved he'd either wandered off in distress or made a deliberate choice to disappear. Suicide. Accident. Case closed. But Charlotte knew her husband. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't depressed. He was excited about retirement, planning trips, counting down the days with a red marker on the calendar. He wouldn't leave her. Not like that. Not without a word.
So she started asking questions. She went back to his old medical practice, hoping to find someone who remembered those final days. Most of the staff had changed, but Sarah, his favorite nurse, was still there. And she remembered something strange. Robert had been anxious that last week, distracted, barely touching his food. When she asked if he was okay, he forced a smile and said he had a lot to wrap up before retirement. But Sarah noticed something else. His hands were shaking, and she'd never seen Robert's hands shake before, not even during emergency surgeries. Then there was Dr. James Harrison, Robert's boss and close friend. Harrison had taken over the practice, sold it for a fortune, and opened a brand new state-of-the-art clinic across town. He'd given a beautiful eulogy at Robert's memorial, speaking of integrity, of dedication. He'd hugged Charlotte, told her he'd help her through the grief. But Sarah mentioned something odd. Harrison had insisted on handling all of Robert's patient files himself, staying late at the office, taking boxes home. At the time, it seemed like a kind gesture. Now, it felt off.
Charlotte went through Robert's old storage unit, searching for anything that might explain what happened. And there, buried in a box, she found his leather day planner. Her breath caught when she flipped to October 15th. There, in his neat handwriting, was an entry. Meeting with Harrison, trail parking lot, 7 a.m. But Robert had told her he was hiking alone. He never mentioned a meeting. Why would he lie? And then she found receipts, 3 of them, from an employment law firm. Robert had been consulting a lawyer about whistleblower protections. He was gathering evidence. About what? She called the firm, and they confirmed it. Robert had been worried about retaliation, about protecting his family if he came forward with serious workplace misconduct. Whatever he'd discovered, it was big enough to risk everything.
The pieces were starting to fit together in the worst possible way. Robert hadn't gone hiking that morning. He'd gone to meet Harrison, and he'd been planning to expose him. Charlotte didn't know what she was dealing with, but she knew she was getting close. And then, the same day she made these discoveries, Harrison showed up at her house. He said the police had called him, that he just wanted to check on her. But when her neighbor mentioned she'd been at the storage unit, Charlotte saw it. The flicker in Harrison's eyes, the way his smile tightened, the sudden tension in his voice. He asked if she'd found anything interesting. It wasn't a casual question. It was a probe, a warning.
Still, she agreed to meet him for coffee, thinking maybe she could learn more. She texted her sister, "Meeting Dr. Harrison at Corner Coffee. If you don't hear from me in 2 hours, call the police." The cafe was busy, the smell of roasted beans in the air, people laughing, life moving on. But as Harrison sat across from her, sipping his black coffee, the mask began to slip. He asked about the storage unit, about Robert's files, about the day planner. When Charlotte mentioned the meeting on October 15th, Harrison's face changed. The kind, grieving friend vanished. In his place was something cold, calculating. He claimed Robert had called him that morning, sounding confused, paranoid, that he'd wanted to cancel the hike, but Robert insisted. But Charlotte knew it was a lie. Robert wouldn't have lied to her. Not about this.
She tried to leave. Harrison blocked her. Then, in the parking lot, he grabbed her arm, his voice low and dangerous. "Where are the files?" he demanded. She said she didn't know what he was talking about. He shoved her against her car, and then he pulled a gun. One moment, she was in a coffee shop in broad daylight. The next, she was being forced into his car at gunpoint. As he drove toward Mount Rainier, the trees closing in around them, Harrison stopped pretending. Robert was going to ruin everything, he said. 40 years of building a practice, helping people, and he wanted to destroy it all over some numbers on a spreadsheet. He called it leveling the playing field, insurance fraud, fake procedures, billing for patients who were already dead, and worse, organ trafficking. A whole criminal network hidden behind a respected medical practice. Robert had found out, and Harrison had offered him money to stay quiet. But Robert refused. He was going to the FBI the next day. They pulled into a remote clearing. Harrison got out, gun in hand, and told her to walk. "We're going to take a little hike," he said, just like Robert did. The forest was quiet. Birds called in the distance. And Charlotte realized this was where Robert had died. This was where Harrison had brought him. And now he was going to make it look like she'd followed her husband into the woods, overcome by grief. But somewhere behind them, sirens began to wail. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees. The police were closing in. Harrison panicked. He raised the gun, and the last thing Charlotte remembered was the cold metal against her temple and the sound of her own voice whispering, "Robert, I'm so sorry." The forest air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, the kind of quiet only deep woods can hold. So still it almost hums. Charlotte sat on a bench just outside the police station, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her head still throbbing from where Harrison had hit her. The EMTs had cleaned the wound, said it didn't need stitches, but every heartbeat sent a dull pulse through her skull. She didn't care. All she could think about was Robert. Not the man who vanished 4 years ago, but the man who had stood up to something dark, who had chosen to do the right thing even when it cost him everything. The detective had said they found remains at the cliff Harrison described. Recovery teams were working to bring them down. After 4 years of emptiness, of wondering if he was alive somewhere, if he had left her on purpose, now she had to face the truth. He was gone. But he hadn't run. He had been murdered. Inside the station, Harrison was still talking. Too much, actually. Once the cuffs were on and the adrenaline wore off, the dam broke.
He wasn't denying it, he was justifying it, telling detectives how Robert had been self-righteous, how he didn't understand the pressure of running a practice, how he was going to ruin everything over some numbers on a spreadsheet. Charlotte's stomach turned. That's all her husband's integrity was to him? Numbers. But those numbers were lives, fake procedures billed to insurance, patients who had died, still being charged for treatments they never got. And worse, organs. Human organs, taken from vulnerable people, sold on the black market, all under the cover of a respected medical practice. Harrison had built a whole criminal operation, and Robert had found it.
Sarah, the nurse, came to the station later that evening. She had heard the news on the local radio. Prominent doctor arrested in connection with cold case hiking disappearance. And she showed up with a thermos of tea and tears in her eyes. She sat beside Charlotte, holding her hand like she used to when Robert was in surgery, and Charlotte waited in the hospital chapel. "I knew something was wrong," Sarah kept saying. "I just didn't know how wrong." She remembered now, little things. The way Harrison had fired 2 maintenance workers right after Robert disappeared. The way he had taken all the patient files home, worked late for days, even though Robert had already left. She remembered how quickly he sold the practice, how he opened a new, flashy clinic with investors she'd never heard of. He wasn't just covering his tracks, Sarah whispered. He was building a new empire on top of Robert's silence.
The FBI got involved fast. Turns out Harrison's organ trafficking ring stretched across state lines. Patients in Seattle, Portland, even Denver. There were records, encrypted files, offshore accounts. But the most chilling thing? Robert had been close, so close. He had already compiled a folder, bank statements, altered patient records, timestamps showing procedures happening when the patients were already in hospice. He had even recorded a few conversations, discreetly, on his phone, the kind of evidence that could bring down an entire network. But he never got the chance to use it. Harrison found out. Maybe he saw something in the office. Maybe one of his men was watching. Whatever happened, he knew Robert was going to the FBI the next day. And so, he made sure Robert never made it.
Charlotte couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the house too quiet, too empty. She kept thinking about that morning, October 15th. Robert kissing her goodbye, saying he needed one last hike to process the big life change. He wasn't processing retirement. He was processing fear. He knew something was wrong. He had met with a lawyer. He had made a plan. But he didn't tell her. Not because he didn't trust her, but because he loved her. He was protecting her. If Harrison had come after her then, if he had known she was involved, she could have been silenced too. Robert had carried that burden alone. And now she was carrying the weight of knowing what he went through.
The next morning, Detective Morrison called. They had recovered Robert's remains. Not much was left after 4 years exposed to the elements, but enough for a positive ID through dental records. They were bringing him home. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table, the sun streaming in just like it had on the morning he left, and cried. Not just for the loss, but for the waste, for the years stolen, for the man who had tried to do the right thing and was punished for it. But she also felt something else. Pride. Robert hadn't backed down. He hadn't taken the money Harrison offered. He hadn't stayed silent. He had stood up, even when he knew it might cost him his life.
Harrison's accomplices were arrested within 48 hours. 2 men, former janitors at the clinic, people Robert had always greeted with a smile, who had helped carry his boxes on his last day, they had been Harrison's muscle, his inside men. One had pushed Robert off the cliff. The other had carried the backpack downstream, hoping the river would swallow it forever. Instead, a beaver dam held it like a secret waiting to be found. Nature had preserved the truth. Charlotte went to the morgue to identify Robert's personal effects. A watch, a wedding ring,
A small notebook with a list of names and dates, patients, procedures, discrepancies, evidence. He had carried it with him that morning, probably planning to hand it over after his meeting. The detective said it was the final piece. With it, they could trace the entire fraud operation. Harrison's plea deal was falling apart. He thought he could trade names for leniency, but the FBI wasn't buying it. Not when they had a dead whistleblower who had died trying to do the right thing.
The day of Robert's funeral, the sun broke through the clouds over Mount Rainier. Hundreds came, former patients, colleagues, friends, even people who had never met him but had read the news. The local paper called him a hero. The governor issued a statement. But Charlotte didn't care about titles. She cared about the man who had kissed her every morning, who had taught her grandson to fish, who had believed in doing the right thing even when no one was watching.
As they lowered the casket, Charlotte placed Robert's old hiking boots beside it. One for the journey he never finished, one for the one he had. And in her pocket, she kept the last receipt from Patterson and Associates, the one dated October 16th. The appointment he never made. The justice he never saw. But it was coming. And this time, she wouldn't look away.
The hospital room was quiet, the kind of hush that only comes late at night when the world slows down and grief finally catches up. Charlotte sat in the stiff chair beside the bed, her hand resting on the bandage on her head, the ache a dull echo of what she'd been through. The doctor had said she was lucky, just a concussion, a few stitches, rest, and she'd be okay. But no one could fix the years of emptiness, the nights spent wondering if Robert had walked away from her or if he'd suffered alone on that mountain. Now she knew the truth, and it hurt more than not knowing ever had.
Robert's remains were being brought down from the cliff. The recovery team had worked through the night, carefully extracting what little was left after 4 years exposed to the elements. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The dental records would confirm it soon, and when they did, she could finally lay him to rest. Not as a man who vanished, not as a victim of accident or despair, but as someone who had stood up for what was right, even when it cost him everything.
Harrison was in custody, screaming through the interrogation that Robert had brought it on himself, that he was the real victim, that he'd built a legacy, saved lives, and Robert had tried to destroy it all over a few billing errors. But the evidence didn't lie. The files Charlotte had found, the day planner, the receipts, the GPS data, had cracked the case wide open. And once Harrison realized the walls were closing in, he started naming names. The 2 men who worked at the clinic, the ones who had helped cover up the fraud, who had pushed Robert off that cliff, they were arrested within hours. The FBI was following the money trail, uncovering a network that stretched from Seattle to Chicago, organ trafficking, fake surgeries, patients billed for treatments they never received, all hidden behind the white coat of a man who smiled at retirement parties and gave eulogies.
But the hardest truth Charlotte had to face wasn't the crime. It was the betrayal. Harrison hadn't just killed Robert. He had spent 4 years pretending to mourn him, sitting at their kitchen table, hugging her, saying Robert was a man of integrity, while knowing he had murdered him for having it. That kind of deception, that level of cruelty, made her skin crawl. And yet, in the middle of all that darkness, Robert's light still shone. Because he hadn't fought back with violence. He hadn't threatened. He had done the one thing a true doctor would do. He had tried to fix it the right way. He went to a lawyer. He gathered evidence. He planned to go to the authorities. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice. At Robert's funeral, the chapel was full. Not just with colleagues and friends, but with people who had no idea who he was. Reporters, former patients, even strangers who had read the story online. The local news had run the headline, "Retired Doctor Killed for Exposing Medical Fraud Ring," and people were angry.
not just at Harrison, but at a system that let something like this happen in the first place. Sarah stood at the front, reading a letter Robert had written to the staff the week before he died. It wasn't about the fraud. It wasn't about fear. It was about gratitude, about how proud he was of the team, how much he loved helping people, how excited he was to finally have time to spend with Charlotte and their grandson. Hearing his words, spoken in Sarah's trembling voice, broke something open in Charlotte's chest. This was her husband. This was the man who woke up at 5 a.m. to make her coffee, who held her hand during every hospital visit, who believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching.
After the service, as the sun dipped behind Mount Rainier, Charlotte stood at the edge of the trailhead where Robert had taken his last steps. She placed a small stone on the ground, something simple, something lasting. No grand monument, just a marker, a reminder. She didn't need a statue to know what Robert had done. She carried it in her heart.
Months later, the trial ended. Harrison was sentenced to life without parole. The accomplices got 20 years. The medical board revoked his license posthumously. And Charlotte? She started a foundation in Robert's name, Whistleblower Support for Healthcare Workers, a place where people could report corruption safely, without fear. Because she knew now that silence protects the powerful, and courage, real courage, is quiet. It doesn't wear a cape. It shows up in the small choices, like keeping a day planner, like calling a lawyer, like refusing to look away.
If you're watching this, maybe you've ever doubted yourself when something felt wrong. Maybe you've stayed quiet because you were afraid. Robert didn't. And because he didn't, an entire criminal network collapsed. The backpack in the Beaver Dam didn't just hold a GPS, it held a truth that refused to stay buried. And sometimes, that's all it takes. One person who refuses to let go. One person who believes that doing the right thing matters, even if no one ever knows.
Charlotte still drinks her coffee by the window every morning, still watches the mountain. And sometimes when the light hits the trees just right, she smiles. Because she knows Robert didn't disappear. He was taken. But his legacy? That's still walking these trails. And it always will.